There are at least two models for thinking about moral conflicts. One of them, popular among deontic logicians who study the nature of obligation, is to think of them as, in some sense, contradictory. You have an obligation to do this, and you have an obligation not to do it, to do something incompatible with it, for example. There you've got a direct clash. It looks like you've got two duties. You cannot possibly fulfill both of them, and so you've got a problem. There's another perspective, though. You might think that essentially we have different kinds of constraints operating on us, different kinds of things we value, and we have to trade one off against another. We have to seek compromises. We have to balance one kind of moral consideration against another. So here it's not so much a question of a direct contradiction among duties, though maybe that's involved. The question is rather trying to balance goods or moral values in general of different kinds. We have to find the right kind of combination, the best kind of mix of all of these things, and so sometimes we have to sacrifice one for the sake of another. True, in that sense, we can't fulfill all of our obligations, we can't have everything we want, but it's more like trading off features in a product where we say, well, this one costs a little more, but it does give us this kind of advantage, and so on. We'd like to pay the least amount for the best possible product, but we can't do that. We have to trade off various features against the price and so on. Well, maybe the ethical life is like that. It's not so much a question of confronting contradictions as just trying to balance various competing considerations. We've talked about the fact that not only different kinds of considerations outside of ethics, but different considerations within ethics, and then in those main branches of virtues, consequences, various kinds of universal constraints, and then the obligations imposed by roles, even within each we can find ways in which conflicts are generated. There's another way of thinking about conflicts, and I want to go through some of the classic ethical dilemmas and think about various applications of them to business ethics. We can group these in three broad categories. Some of them stem from prior acts of my own, for example, or prior actions of somebody else. So let's take this simplest example. I've made promises. And maybe some of those promises generate ethical dilemmas. After all, I have an obligation to keep my promises. But that can cause problems in at least two ways. The first one, maybe I've made an immoral promise. I've promised to do an immoral thing. So someone said to me, for example, look, we've got a problem. Somebody in the company has violated the law. We need to cover this up. And I made a promise to help them cover it up. But then I come to regret that. I think, wait a minute, it's really wrong to cover this up. This is not fair to the stockholders. Something illegal has happened here. I really have a duty to report it. But I've promised not to. So in this case, I've got a moral conflict between, well, the obligation to keep my promise and then the obligation I have not to do something illegal or not to do something immoral by engaging in the cover-up. So there are times when people simply make immoral promises and then later regret them and realize, wait, this is something that should not be done, and now you've got a moral conflict. This can also happen because I can make two promises and they can end up conflicting with one another. So I can promise to do this, I can promise to do that, and then I can realize, wait, I can't do both. I can promise to go to the party and promise to go to dinner with that person, and then it turns out that the night of the dinner is the night of the party. And suddenly I realize, oh, now what do? I can't do both. I've got a moral dilemma. But it's not as if it was immoral to promise to meet the friend for dinner. It's not immoral to promise to go to the party. It's just that now both can't be accomplished. That kind of thing can happen in business all the time. I agree that I'll go to that meeting, and I also agree that I'll be present at the closing. And then it turns out that the closing is scheduled for exactly the same time as the meeting. Now what do? I can't fulfill both obligations. Or sometimes it's a question of deadlines. I promised to get that done by the time it's needed. I promised to get that other thing done. I think I'm going to have time to do both. But then, due to an unfortunate coincidence of circumstances, I don't. I have to choose, and I have to break one of those promises. There can be different kinds of dilemmas that stem from prior actions of mine that were themselves unjust. I've done something wrong, let's say, and now I face a moral dilemma. What do I do about that? It may be no easy way exists, for me to resolve that. So here's a classic example, sometimes called the Simonate dilemma. Let's say I've lied to get my current position. I falsified my academic credentials, for example, or I lied about my experience, or I listed some prominent person there as a reference who I knew was away and couldn't be contacted, just to associate myself with somebody I don't even know, and so on. I might have done various things like that in the past to get my job. But now, well, I feel bad about that. I think I really should come clean about what I've done in the past. But look, it turns out I'm really good at my job, and I would let a lot of people down. I would fail to fulfill all sorts of obligations if I were to do that. So now what do I do? There's an entire TV series based on this premise called Suits, about someone who essentially lies about having a law degree, turns out to be a fantastic lawyer, knows the law inside and out, but lied to get the position. And so we have both his dilemma, look, what should I do now? But also the dilemma of the person who hired him knowing this and is covering up for somebody else's wrongdoing, but in doing that has committed wrongdoing of his own. And now what? So that kind of thing can happen. It may be that I've done something wrong in the past, but now various obligations have been generated based on not revealing what I've done in the past, and yet it looks like I have an obligation to reveal that and confess what I've done. Now what do I do? There's a real dilemma there. Can that happen in business? Well, sure, it can happen in all sorts of ways, and not only by the falsification of qualifications and so on. It may be that mistakes were made in the past, either by me or by somebody else. But now revealing those mistakes is going to prevent us from fulfilling other obligations. Maybe there was a part of that contract we didn't fulfill, and really, to be honest, we ought to reveal that we weren't able to fulfill that part of the contract. But revealing that is going to mess up the rest of the arrangement and basically make it impossible for us to fulfill even more important obligations. What do we do? There can be problems arising from innocent circumstances, like the case where promises of mine conflict for no fault of my own. I had no way of envisioning that those two meetings would be scheduled at the same time. And so how can that sort of thing arise just through innocent circumstances? Well, in a variety of ways. It might be, as part of my job, that I have an obligation to perform that task and an obligation to perform this task. And ordinarily that can be done. But for some reason, one of them turns out to be complicated this time and takes much more time. I can't get them both done. I haven't done anything wrong. It's just an unfortunate circumstance that leads me to be unable to fulfill both of those obligations. It can be that that happens all the time between, for example, obligations within a family. You have an obligation to, let's say, be at your child's birthday party, but you also have an obligation to finish this job, and it turns out it's taking a lot longer. How can you fulfill your obligation to your child at the same time that you fulfill your obligation at work? You can face a moral dilemma. These kinds of problems can arise in other kinds of ways. Sometimes it's simply due to different criteria. We've talked about the problem of disparate impact. Something that is facially neutral, doesn't appear to be discriminatory and applies the same criterion to everyone, nevertheless has adverse impacts on certain groups. There are very different outcomes for different groups under that facially neutral criterion. What do we do about that? There are two conceptions of justice competing here. One says treat everyone equally. The other says try to get equal outcomes. It might be that you can't do it, that in this case getting equal outcomes means treating people very unequally, which takes precedence. That's not something that you might say has been generated by some mistake I've made morally. It's something generated simply by two different criteria that apply to this case in a way that forces me to choose. William of Auxerre and Alexander of Hales, two medieval philosophers, came up with something they called the poor parent's dilemma. Someone has promised to take care of his parents who are very poor and depending upon him for help, but also has another obligation that is going to require him to abandon that responsibility. What should he do? Jean-Paul Sartre, in Being in Nothingness, talks about an example like this, a real-life case of a student during World War II who felt that he had an obligation to his country to join the resistance, but also had an ailing mother at home and felt an obligation to take care of her. And it looks like in this case, following the one obligation to fight for the resistance, for example, forces him to abandon another responsibility. That kind of thing can happen. You can have a responsibility that then it looks like comes into conflict, comes into at least competition with some other kind of obligation, one resulting from a war, one resulting from a tremendous opportunity, or the great need of another family member or good friend, and so on. And in those cases, what do you do? How do you take care of your responsibilities? It might be that the responsibilities from these different directions are great enough you can't fulfill them all. Augustine talks about an adultery dilemma. It looks as if adultery is the kind of thing that could never be moral. Indeed, Aristotle lists murder, adultery, and several other things as things that are not means between extremes. It is simply never acceptable to murder. It is never acceptable to commit adultery. And Augustine agrees, but he says there are cases, nevertheless, where it looks like there is a real moral conflict. He envisions one where someone demands sexual favors, essentially imposing a threat, saying that they will cause great destruction. Maybe they will reveal a certain ring of people, in this case, Orthodox Christians he has in mind, who are going to be persecuted by the Romans. But this can arise in a variety of other ways. In the movie The Lives of Others, there's something like that. A government official demands sexual favors from a woman, or he will destroy her career and her boyfriend's career. And so it looks as if in these cases, there's a very serious moral dilemma faced. Tremendous destruction is going to happen. Is there any business equivalent to this? Well, involving adultery, maybe not. But there is an equivalent to this in all sorts of less dramatic settings. There can be cases of bribery, cases of blackmail. Essentially, that's what's happening here. People are being coerced. And ordinarily, it would be wrong to give in to that coercion. You shouldn't pay the bribe. You shouldn't commit adultery. You shouldn't submit to the blackmail. But it might be that very serious moral considerations are at stake, and you feel as if you'll be betraying someone if you actually don't submit and don't allow yourself to be coerced into doing something wrong in these cases, because it looks like great harm might result. Other responsibilities you feel that you have may be betrayed. So that kind of thing can happen in business, and as we'll see in international business, even more so, when one encounters mores in various countries that are quite different, and where things are expected that appear to be immoral to us and that violate our own social and business norms. There are also moral dilemmas that stem from the nature of roles. We've talked about some of those already. A classic dilemma discussed by St. Thomas Aquinas is a communion dilemma. And it's kind of an entertaining case, disturbing case. The priest has consecrated the elements for communion and is about to serve them. But as he's pouring the wine, which is now the blood of Christ, into the communion goblet, he sees that a poisonous spider has fallen into the bottom of the goblet. And he realizes that there's a chance that the wine is now poisoned. Does he offer it to the congregation? Why is this a moral dilemma? Well, because he has an obligation to protect the lives of his flock, obviously, but also he has consecrated the elements. He has an obligation to treat the blood of Christ with great respect. And so what does he do? Well, Aquinas says he pours it out. He gets rid of it, but does it in a ritualized way. He doesn't consume it. He doesn't give it to the flock. And ordinarily, to fail to do one of those two things would be to commit a serious religious error. It would be to commit a sin. But in this case, Aquinas says, there is another consideration at stake. Well, you might think that has nothing to do with the business world, but actually I think it does, because there are cases now where through that kind of unfortunate circumstance, you realize that doing something that fulfills a responsibility, fulfills a duty of yours, is going to cause great harm. And so suddenly you realize, wait, what do? I have promised under the terms of the contract to do this, but I realize now that if I fulfill the terms of that contract, tremendous harm is going to result. Or I realize that something's gone deeply wrong with the process. I promised to get the job done by a certain deadline, But then I realized, wait, some of the building materials that we put into the project, we now realize were inferior. We had no way of knowing it at the time. We didn't do anything wrong. It's rather like the spider falling into the cup. But now we realize, wait a minute, if we go on and meet the deadline, there is a serious chance that this building is not going to be inhabitable. And so it looks best to stop it now, not to permit that great harm or even the potential for that great harm to result. But that means breaking the promise, missing the deadline. And so that kind of thing can happen where you realize, wait, something's gone wrong or something is going wrong, and fulfilling the terms, in this case of the promise of the contract, but it can be taking care of responsibilities of other kinds too, is going to result in tremendous damage. And so I've got a very real constraint operating on me to do this, but on the other hand, I start recognizing that because of circumstances, actually fulfilling that obligation is going to cause tremendous harm. And then I realize, wait, it is not so clear what I ought to do in those circumstances. I face a moral dilemma. This kind of thing can happen in business all the time. So for example, a pharmaceutical company might look and say, look, there are different kinds of constraints operating on me. I want to keep drug prices low, but I also want to innovate. I want to do research. I want to cure new diseases. I want to find a vaccine, for example, for the coronavirus. But that requires a lot of money. That requires a tremendous research effort. And that means that initially, at least, that is going to have to be built into the price of the drug. What do I do? The same thing happens in the energy industry. I want to supply an electric grid for people that respects and protects the environment, but that also enables them to have energy reliably when they need it most and at the lowest possible cost. Those are different kinds of constraints: an environmental constraint, an economic constraint, a reliability and technical constraint. And actually that one turns out to be complicated. There are various things that go into that. But now, given all of that, what do? I've got to balance different kinds of constraints together. And that sort of thing affects almost every company and every business. There are different kinds of moral values at stake, and you have to find the trade-offs among them that allow you to resolve those dilemmas in the best possible way. We see that in a dramatic form in the trolley problem. The trolley is out of control, headed down the track. It's headed down toward 5 people who can't possibly get off the track. You, standing by, realize this is a switch that could divert it to another track, but there is one person on that track. It looks like by killing the one, you could save the 5. Do you do it? When people are asked this, about 70% say, yes, I'd pull the switch. About 30% say, no, I wouldn't do it. I realize I'm letting 5 people die, but in this case, it really feels like I am causing the death of one. I'm murdering the one. I'm killing the one. I'd rather let 5 people die than actually actively kill the one. Well, there's no definite right or wrong answer here, and no matter which way you happen to come down, we can put pressure on you by changing the numbers. What if it's not 5 to 1? What if it's only 2 to 1? What if it's 5 to 4? What about that? But if you're on the other side, well, what if it's not 5 against 1? What if it's 10 and 1? What if it's 100 and 1? What if it's 1,000, 1,000,000 and 1? Would you really not kill the one to save 1,000,000? It becomes complicated. So it's hard to know exactly how to make these kinds of trade-offs. You might think that's a rather artificial example, but think about healthcare, for example, where we really might have to face triage decisions and decide who we're going to save. We don't have enough resources to meet everybody's medical needs, so who takes priority? Do we allow that one to die to save these? Do we actually consign these people to death in order to have resources to treat those? And so on. Those can be complicated. Think about organ transplant cases for another kind of case that starts feeling a bit like a trolley problem. In addition to those cases, there can be less traumatic situations. Our companies under financial pressure, we're facing the need for cutbacks. Well, if I fire these people, lay them off, maybe delete that entire division or sell it off to someone else, maybe I can save the jobs of the rest of the people in the company. That looks a little like firing one to save 5. And that kind of thing may be something that goes on in business all the time. When times are good, you hope you don't have to face that. But in difficult economic times, companies face that kind of choice all the time. Do we lay off these people in order to try to protect the jobs, the salaries, the benefits, and so on of these other people? And that's a bit like a business world trolley problem. Well, all of those dilemmas are difficult dilemmas. I'm not here going to say anything about how we might go about resolving them. That's a topic for another video. But it's important to realize that we can be hit with all sorts of different ethical dilemmas, and that we have to be sensitive to them, thinking not only about conflicts of obligations, duties, responsibilities, but also about the best way of finding the right balance, the right compromise, the right trade-offs among the different things we value.